Thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you about South Africa's foreign policy. We have heard of SKY, Seoul National University, Korea National University, Yonsei, and therefore we are aware that Korean University is one of the most prestigious universities in Korea, and therefore it's with a sense of great pride that you have taken an interest in my country, which is but a small mid-income country on the southern tip of Africa. And it also gives me a great opportunity to talk about my country. So thank you very much for the invitation. On just a lighter note, as we talk about foreign policy, countries have all sorts of theories and philosophies, frameworks that inform their foreign policies. Some belong to associations based on their geographical locations, like ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Countries. I think there's a case to be made for a few countries who are named after their geographical locations, like South Africa and South Korea and maybe South Sudan, to maybe form an association. We could call ourselves the G3 of the South. But that is just on a lighter note. The question I have been asked to, this is not responding. Okay. The question I have been asked to talk about is South Africa's foreign policy. And the first point I would like to make is that we have made a link between our domestic policy and our foreign policy as the main motivation to the design and construction of our foreign policy. Now, to illustrate this connection, the link between domestic and foreign policy, I'd like to use the analogy of a tree. Now, a tree has the branches and leaves above the surface, and the roots are in the ground. So an observer sees merely the branches and the leaves above the surface. And oftentimes we don't take the importance of the roots very seriously. And we might even ask the question, which is more important, the roots or the branches and the leaves? As a mid-income country, we have to be very pragmatic and make sure that our foreign policy is not only built on idealism, but supports the goals of our domestic policy. So, in making this choice, one has to try and catch a balance between domestic policy and foreign policy. If you are focused too much on domestic policy and you consider foreign policy to be not important at all, one has the danger of creating a kind of autarky where you just look at your own self-reliance and think that you can develop without any relations with other countries in the world, that has proven to be not a successful approach. Openness is a very important element in development. However, if you emphasize too much the foreign policy dimension, then a country and its leaders can become alienated from the people. And you might find countries that are very well known in the world, and then at some point they lose an election or they are subjected to a revolt of the people. That can happen. So the best approach is to get some direction from nature and get a balance between the two, because I'm sure even if you ask a tree, the roots might say, well, we are the most important element, because if we don't get water and nutrients from the ground, you wouldn't see the flowers and the leaves above the surface. And equally, the leaves would say something about their importance. But the best thing is the balance between the two. So the point I would like to make is that our foreign policy is to a large extent anchored in our domestic policy. And I will now go about trying to illustrate that. The first element in working through our domestic policy is some regard for our history and our culture. And anyone who knows a little bit about South African history will know that everything pivots around the end of apartheid in 1994. And so in a sense, our history begins, our modern history begins in 1994. And we tend to think as South Africans about what happened before 1994 and what happened after 1994. So the analysis of post-apartheid conditions since 1994 is a very important part of our outlook. We also then take regard to our current domestic priorities, but also every country has to analyze the international situation for itself and decide how it positions itself in the world and what elements of the current situation it takes into consideration for deciding its own foreign policy priorities. So if I could just say something about the history and the culture of South Africa. Now, most of us modernists just want to move very fast. And we tend to look at the country for what it is today and don't have the time to go into its history and even to try and understand its culture. We want to suggest that that would be a mistake. Even policymakers of a country need to take consideration of its history, because the self-identity of a people and a nation is largely constructed over its understanding of its own history and its culture. Diplomats have to do this all the time, by the way, because as I represent South Africa in Korea, I have to try to understand Korea's history, Korea's culture, so that I can interact with Koreans hopefully in a more meaningful manner. But the history of South Africa, like all countries in Africa, is a history of colonialism. Apartheid, many of you look very young, might not even be familiar with this term, but those of us who matured in the 80s and the 70s will know that the South African question and the issue of apartheid was a major global security issue. But apartheid was nothing else but a special kind of colonialism, where the model of colonialism, as in white minority rule, was perfected. Institutionalized racism was perfected in South Africa. So the social impact of that was you had minority rule, and the majority of people were marginalized because of race. So the issues of poverty, inequality, race, and struggle are very rooted in the South African identity. I might just mention here that South Africa was the last country in Africa to be decolonized. So there's over 350 years of experience of domination. So that the result of all that is a constitution and institutions based on these core principles of non-racism, non-sexism, and a democratic state. So this inclusivity is an alternative to that. So everything that shapes our identity revolves around these core principles. Today, South Africa is a paragon of a liberal democratic state. Some time ago, I engaged with some professors at Yonsei University, and they told me that South Africa is considered, our constitution is considered one of the most liberal in the world. And that is so because we come from this bitter experience of being marginalized and oppressed. And so we posit these principles of inclusivity. You know, South Africa is one of the most diverse countries in the world in racial terms. And I know Korea talks about multiculturalism. We talk about non-racialism, so that race shouldn't matter. In fact, the students of constitutionalism might look at South Africa not as an example of the nation state, but of a state consisting of many nations. That's how diverse we are. But that is another topic. A few words on the culture that we espouse in South Africa. Of course, everything anchors on a deep sense of African spiritualism. We call it Ubuntu. I don't know if any of you have heard of this term, but it says that we are what we are through other people. That's the essence of it. Can you be kind if most of the people around you think you are evil? Can you think of yourself as generous if people around you think that you are a miser? Can you think of yourself as being exceptional when people around you dislike you? So the point here is you can only be what you want to be through your reflection by other people. You are what you are through other people. This is the essence of South African culture. That culture is the one that bound us as a people during a period of 350 years of colonialism and over 50 years of apartheid. So we couldn't survive if there was not a sense of community, if there wasn't a sense of support to those who are weaker and vulnerable. So that sense of generosity is an important part of our self-identity. So all these things that later on leaders of South Africa became quite well known for example, Nelson Mandela is synonymous with reconciliation. That reconciliation didn't just spring out of the heart of Nelson Mandela. It's deeply rooted in the fabric of his people. Concern for the weak and vulnerable in our society. These are very important elements of our outlook. We are now 20 years since apartheid was removed and South Africa became an independent and democratic state. And so 2014 represents 20 years of democracy. You have invited me here in a year in which we are celebrating in South Africa what we call 20 years of democracy. So we have reviewed what the socio-economic conditions are in South Africa. And I'd like just to share with you those findings. There's a study put out by Goldman Sachs, which is a credible evaluation of what has transpired in South Africa. And I invite any one of you to read that. Firstly, the point must be made that South Africa should be considered today a stable democracy. We've had 5 national elections. The last one was just this year in May, where we had a 72% turnout for the elections. Now that says, I think, quite a bit that the citizens of the country are still energized, still engaged with the democratic process. So by any measure, we should surely be considered a stable democracy now. GDP, our economy, this is a misnomer. The GDP has grown 77% in real terms since 1994. That is, the size of the economy has grown by 77%. Average incomes have increased by 30%, and our stock exchange, remember I told you that the key social character of South Africa is the issue of race, and the black people of South Africa were the marginalized. So it's important that a democratic country uplifts the majority black people of our society. And so these measures are important to indicate that the wealth of the country as reflected in the stock exchange. Only 5% was in black hands in 1995, but in 2012 it's 21%. The middle class now, the majority of the middle class are black. Basic services, water, people's access to water has grown from 63 to 96%, access to electricity. I won't run through all those statistics, merely to say there has been a major investment in access to basic services by the people. And I think the statistics reveal that quite clearly. I just want to point this out regarding gender. And I've just looked at a few newer statistics as I was coming here that, remember, we pride ourselves as a non-racial, non-sexist state. And so women are favored to a great deal in our country. And in Parliament, pre-1994, there were 2.7% women in Parliament. Today, it's 43%. In Cabinet, there was about 1% of women in Cabinet. In 2014, it's 42%. So these are, I think, real social gains. However, there still are challenges. And the big challenge is inequality. That's still got a racial dimension to it. But I think it's true to say that this is a feature of all liberal democratic states in the world today. We are all grappling with this issue of dealing with inequalities in society. Economic growth is not as a rate that would really help us address all of our social problems. So this is a big challenge. There's still a gap in basic services. Social cohesion is rooted, but we still have flare-ups from time to time. And crime, which we think is related to inequality, is still a feature of our society. When we look at the international situation, I alluded earlier on to the fact that inequalities are evident in all societies around the world, even the most developed countries. This results in competition for investors, and I think the corporations have the best of all worlds because all countries in the world are trying to put in place frameworks that make their countries more attractive than the others. So it's a very competitive world out there. It seems to us that globalization, the framework around which all countries were opening up, and was the inspiration to so much growth and prosperity in the world since the collapse of the socialist world in 1992. It seems like it's heading into headwinds since the events of the Ukraine. There are sanctions and counter-sanctions that are emerging, and there's a real danger that the world would evolve into two camps again. It's not very certain, but there's a hint that the world might very well move in a direction that reverses globalization. Economic growth is still very uncertain. Africa enjoyed its biggest spurt of growth in the first decade of the 21st century. And that was largely driven by the commodities demand. But as growth has slowed down in many parts of the world, this has impacted Africa, and growth is slower there too. Even the dynamos of Asia are beginning to stutter. So it's a very uncertain economic outlook. I think the security environment is a lot more complex, if I can be diplomatic about that. In the Middle East, terrorism is endemic. Recently, defense minister of an important country said we must all brace ourselves for a 30-year war in the Middle East. We see almost medieval practices like beheadings taking place. In Asia, all sorts of strange things happening. Malaysia Airlines just disappeared. It's never been found. No one can account for it. Very strange. In Africa, we have terrorism. We have epidemic diseases that are emerging as security problems. So the question really arises, what's going on? Sometimes in moments like this, you have to turn to your poets, because they can say things much more succinctly than any of us. And my favorite was a musician from the US. I don't know if there are any Americans in the audience here. But I liked soul music and rhythm and blues when I was young. And there was a musician called Marvin Gaye who wrote great music in the 60s. And one of his best songs to me was a song called What's Going On. And it was his attempt to understand the world in the 60s, where there was a war in Vietnam, there was violence and conflict in the inner cities of the US, and he said, what's going on? And it seems to me almost that when you look at the world here, that question is a valid one, because no one seems to have immediate answers. So it's a very worrying, almost a very disturbing world. So the question is, how does a small mid-income country in the southern tip of Africa survive in a world in which there's not much economic growth, there's very troubling security environments, and it has its own domestic socio-economic challenges, its own history to try and address? These are the principles which underpin our choices, which I've tried to say to you don't come out of the reading of books, but they come from our real lived experience. The first one is a sense of solidarity that we have with people around the world who suffer injustices, because we were one of the victims of colonialism, apartheid, for a very long period of time. So there's a natural empathy in South Africa for people who suffer discrimination and injustice around the world. This, as I explained to you, is also inspired by our national feeling of Ubuntu. We care about people. We also extol the virtues of multilateralism and cooperation. My own department used to be called the Department of Foreign Affairs of South Africa. It is now called the the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, because we emphasize the issue, the principle that no one country can solve the problems of the world alone today. And that it's better that we pool our resources, we pool our knowledge, we pool our experiences and find work out new approaches to the problems of the world. In the end, our own experience was that the South African problem was addressed through peaceful negotiations and the involvement of the international community. So that's a very important principle in our outlook. South Africa was, as I said, one of the key global issues of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But it was resolved in a peaceful negotiation, ultimately. The world remembers Nelson Mandela because he championed a peaceful resolution of that conflict. We think that experience is valid and that principle is one worth fighting for in international affairs today. And then, of course, we, as I said to you, are pragmatic. We know that we can't solve the problems of the world ourselves. We can do our bit, but in the main, we also have to make sure that our foreign affairs contributes in some way to resolve our own remaining socio-economic challenges. Finally, I come to our priorities. We are a small mid-income country in the southern tip of Africa, but we contribute about 30% of the GDP of Africa, being one of the bigger economies on the continent. And so our foreign policy's first priority is geographically focused. We focus on Africa, the continent, and our sub-region, the Southern African Development Corporation. And we focus on ending of conflicts, development issues, and the building of democracy and institutions and good governance. Economic diplomacy, that's what guides our policy in Asia and also Korea itself. The reason we have an embassy here is to advance our trade and investment with Korea for mutual benefit. Solidarity. I've given you the history and the culture that makes us sensitive and supports the building of just societies around the world. But in brackets, I say no crusades. We are very pragmatic. We are firm believers in democracy, human rights, but we conduct no crusades. We think that things like democracy are like love, and you are many young people here, so I'm sure you can empathize with the feeling of love. Democracy is like love. It must come from within. It can't be imposed from outside. That is our view. We have democracy in South Africa. We fought for it. And there's nothing that will trigger people going out to the cruise, will trigger people going out to the barricades quicker in South Africa than any threat to democracy. It's real. It comes from within. I spoke to you earlier on about our emphasis on multilateralism, cooperation, and peaceful resolution in conflict. So South Africa is very active on these global issues and in those global institutions. With that, I would like to conclude. I want to thank you very much for being such a kind audience. I saw some of you smile at my lousy jokes. I've only seen one person fall asleep in the audience, so that's a good sign for talking at 5:30 on a Monday afternoon. Thank you very much.